So this is a long awaited one. I've been meaning to have you on here, and I ironically don't talk about Skyline much on this podcast, but I think it'll be fun for everybody to get to know you and get to know kind of Skyline, where it comes from, and where we're going in the future. Granted, I'm probably going to assume people know more than they do. So just to start, I think it'll be good for you to give a quick background about the family and where you sit, other than 15 feet away from me.
Yeah, it's been fun to watch these 15 feet away and see all the things that are going on and the cool people you have here. But as far as me and the family and the business, I mean, this is year 103, and sometimes we think about, locally, well, a lot of people know us, and yes, that's true, but there are also a lot of people that don't know us. Um, I think we'll talk more about that as far as where we're trying to go and what we're trying to do. But me as Matt Kraus, the fourth generation Kraus member in leadership at Skyline, it's been quite a journey. We're doing this a long time now, and we have new partners in Schuko who present all sorts of exciting opportunities for us, and we have a whole country in front of us, doing development in all sorts of different cities, with different requirements, different performance criteria, different development criteria. But coming back to your question, just talking about a little bit more about me and my journey, which it's probably my least favorite thing to do is talk about me, is I think I'm in year 15 or 16 here now. I actually used to intern in the summers as a college kid and as a high school kid installing windows, working in the factory, working in the office, seeing different parts of this business. At the time, I had no idea what I was doing. It was a summer job, but I've come to really appreciate what that experience has taught me from seeing this business from the ground up, really seeing the magic of what we do. Because at the end of the day, and I say this often, we are building and installing windows. Even if I'm not building them or you're not building them, we are building and installing windows. That's what our company does. Yes, we design them, we service them, all that stuff too. But that's the core of what we do. So I sort of joke the magic happens in the field and in the factory. And I think there's a difference for people that have seen it and people who have not. So my journey starts long ago as a teenager installing windows.
So I think there's, as an outsider, at least before we get into some of the nuances of the New York market, how do you describe to people not in the industry, family members, relatives, friends, whoever, and sort of reflecting on your experience those days? I think looking at architecture, it has this kind of sexy design element to it. And then you really get into the raw side of construction and see it can be an ugly business at times. So how I guess has your position evolved in or perspective in terms of sort of the reality of these in this industry and some things that I guess grind your gears?
Yeah, I mean, what an interesting question. Starting in this business as like a naive kid who doesn't know any better. And I think the business didn't know any better for a long time too. We were a business that started out not manufacturing our own windows. We were a business that was never involved in new construction projects. That's in the last 15 years, a development change in our DNA that has significantly changed who we are, how we operate, what we do, the types of people that we operate with. I feels like we're in a whole different league now than where I came from. I remember all the projects we used to deal with were replacement jobs, buildings that existed. You were dealing with a board, maybe an architect, maybe a window consultant, but so many of the jobs that we did on a larger scale, it was the condo board and Skyline Windows, and that was it. And we were their advisor, and we were their engineer, and we were their consultant. And the world has evolved. It's a totally different place now. I don't know that there's any large scale window replacement project that happens without a host of professionals. And I think that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. I think that the quality of the projects that happen now are happening at a much higher level. But the work involved is also at a totally different level. It's um, just from structural calculations to shop drawing complexity on what maybe an industry person would consider a cookie cutter job may require 4 or 5 times the effort and time that it did, I don't know, 10 years ago. So it's a different world today.
If you consider the market that we sort of operate and live in and we're bred from, it's probably one of the most stringent markets in the world, if not in the country. And yet, people like your father and Jeff, and even people I've had on the podcast, like Elliot and AJ, people that have seen Windows go in the 80s, 90s, a time when they weren't even engineering the connections. And who knows who were slapping the windows in, and who knows what was really going in. Yet the buildings continue to operate and things just continue to go smoothly as they did. So, I mean, do you, it's a strange question, but do you look at any of the existing infrastructure with concern? And do you think things have gone a little too far in the direction of caution that maybe leaves us stumped at times? Or where's that balance in terms of, how much stringency these projects really require?
Yeah, that's a very delicate yet spicy question. Uh, for all of our consultant friends that will be tuning in, I think it's a delicate balance, right? So I think these are important things that we have to look at, and we can sometimes err on the side of ridiculous in terms of what is being specified versus what is being actually possible. But that delicate balance is what also pushes the needle as from a product standpoint, from a capability standpoint. Um, we learn things as time goes on, as far as what happens to materials, what happens to uh, fasteners, sealants, all these different things. You look back at the nickel sulfide incidents that happened in Boston, nobody knew any better, and then all of a sudden we knew better, and we knew how to look for things. So I think we all get smarter over time and we learn things over time. And technology is also developing at an exponential pace right now. So, we're in many ways trying to keep up with that. And I think a lot of this is also driven by natural competition. People saying, "Hey, I can now do things that others aren't offering right now. So how do I advertise that, sell that to the architects, the engineers, the consultants as the thing that they should have?" That's part of the job we have to do as well. And I think from an owner standpoint, not me, Skyliner, I mean an owner of a building, it's also a delicate balance of saying, oh, great, I can have, triple pane, triple coated, triple, belts and suspenders, all these things. Um, but it's going to cost 3 or 4x, or it's going to make for an impractical installation or application. That's when the intelligent and experienced owners can weigh in and say, hey, great, I see that. I understand the benefit, but I also understand the economics of doing this project and what needs to take place in order for me to meet the requirements that I need to run my business successfully. So I think that's a very delicate balance that is fought every day, of architects and engineers and consultants pushing the latest and greatest and the best, us as the window guys and people trying to navigate that, but at the same time advise owners on not only what we think is really necessary from an experience standpoint, but to help them make an informed decision on what's going to be best for them, right? They don't have our experience. They're not putting in windows every day. Maybe this is the 10th window project they've done, but to say, hey, here's what we see. Here's, as the people doing it every day, here's what we think is going to give you the experience that you want, the performance that you want, at the dollars that you want. And that's the fight that we fight every day.
So I want to take that in two directions. First of all, from a liability standpoint, as the codes have become more stringent, the requirements have become more stringent with things like local law 11 with bird-friendly glazing, and then what does that even mean? And does the glass that I'm supplying even comply? And then things like local law 97, where you're looking at a whole building performance-based rating that an owner can go back and measure against. Do you find more liability is now being placed on the contractors and away from the design professionals? Or do you think it's evenly spread throughout?
Truthfully, it's hard for me to really say because I'm not from the viewpoint of others. But I'll say with that caveat, I think there's a lot of pressure being put on contractors to own more and more of the liability. I think the owners are putting more pressure on the architects and the consultants. And again, things have become more complex. We have more rules, more regulations. Um, but it's, we have this sort of internal debate all the time. I'll use this just as an example of, older buildings being built to older building codes and windows that are being with design pressures that are above the design pressures that the building was built to 50 years ago. How does that make sense? So we have things that we see on a regular basis that I find it's our job to just educate people, and say, hey, your building was built to a code in the 60s or 70s to 35 PSF. You're replacing the windows now and you're asking for 50. Why? What are we trying to accomplish here? And again, I use that as just one example.
And that goes back to the question of are we setting criteria that's either not realistic or getting us stumped and focusing on the wrong things? I mean, I talk to Elliot all the time about test criteria and what the purpose is of some of these tests. And I use this term a lot now, that it's a torture test, essentially to investigate and find any imperfections within the system, because if you're selling something that should last for decades, you want to expose that, and then a conversation can be had. So, all right, you have a couple of droplets of water after 14 and a half minutes. What does that mean? But when the owner gets a test report and it said Skyline Windows leaked, they failed, change orders, legality comes into play. And
it's
so
you either passed or you failed. But I think what's happening behind the scenes is, again, the magic of, okay, what's really going on? Is it a window problem? Is it a collateral construction problem? What needs to take place? And at the end of the day, what everybody's trying to avoid is some sort of legal matter, and rather, how do we fix the problem? But these testing criterias are, I think what they're set out for is to protect owners. We test it above the criteria, that is necessary to then reduce to the criteria that we need. But, like, let me take the other side for a second and say, not to take any, I'll say, political stance, but look at the climate conditions that we face now. I don't, I'm sure we could pull up all the data on this if we wanted to. I think we experience higher temperatures. I think we experience higher wind than ever, in the last 10, 20, 50 years. We're building buildings taller than ever, so naturally we're going to have a requirement for, higher design pressures. So many of these things, I think you could easily look at and say, well, we need them, because our buildings are getting more complicated. And the world we live in is getting more complicated. That being said, it's a constant battle with reality of what is really possible. Why do we really need this? And if I come back to my example, if we're replacing windows in a building that's 50 years old and built to a 35 PSF design pressure, why is a 50 design pressure being required? It's hard for me to come up with a good answer, but we see that all the time, and I think for owners who are doing their first window replacement ever, they lean heavily on a consultant or an architect or an engineer to lay this out because they don't know any better, which is smart. Just like us, we would hire professionals to do something that's not in our area. But then we come back and we say, well, okay, we can do that. It may cost more. It may take longer to install. And is that really what you want to do? So there we're creating some friction for a situation that is in many ways unnecessary. So I think in other words, it's how do we continue to focus on what's important, knowing that what's important continues to change.
Well, all right. So what you said before, and at the end of the day, you need to be competitive from a price standpoint. So
You have to be.
you have these more stringent requirements, higher design criteria, designers wanting to test new systems, push the envelope in terms of what providers are capable of, coupled with the fact that owners and GCs are expecting the subs to be more competitive. So naturally, we've seen globalization. We've seen many competitors all over the world enter into the New York market. Do you think that's a combination of what we just discussed and something that we'll see bleeding into other markets?
Absolutely. I did a study, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, and I believe in North America, New York, the five boroughs represent 66 or 67% of all tall buildings in North America. So New York has a super concentration of uh, construction and the market that we play to. But you start to look into other booming cities as well. Miami, Toronto, Nashville, and I think New York is the biggest, so it's garnering the most attention right now from a globalization standpoint. But we are seeing, I mean, when I came into this business, there was no importing of product from other countries. That is an everyday part of the business now. People bringing in product from all parts of the world because the economic environment here is very different than in other parts of the world. So that is a challenge. The challenge for those people is our requirements are much different than the requirements in their local market. And I think that's somewhat hard to figure out as a first timer, but more and more people are figuring it out. And they're getting help from a lot of local people. So owners, in today's market with interest rates where they are and inflation where it is, are looking at the bottom line and saying, hey, if I can have a product that meets the specifications and is at the right number and it comes from wherever, I'm willing to try. And there are enough people willing to bring it in that it's creating a very competitive landscape. So
What was
really,
what was your first experience importing overseas material on a large scale project? Was it glass from Spain on Domino in Brooklyn? Or
for us?
yes.
Yeah.
And what can you recall from that experience? What did you learn?
So I remember when we learned about Tivitec in Spain, and I think it was actually AJ LaBelle who had mentioned them, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago as really an up and coming company. And we've been dealing with uh, domestic glass manufacturers forever, but as we started to get into new construction and the tolerances increased and the projects got bigger, we started looking at other options as well, not only from a capability standpoint, but from a pricing standpoint. And I remember going to visit them before we started buying anything from them. And they're a tremendous outfit with really incredible capabilities. But there's a lot more to work through. Customs, logistics, containers coming in the right way. And customs is always a bit of a wild card as far as things clearing in the time frame that you want. So from a how do we handle it at Skyline? We had to change our process as far as getting approval sooner, knowing that the lead time is going to be longer. Making sure we get our purchase orders out ahead of time for things that have longer lead times so we can hit the project at the time we need to hit the project. But I think that was that wasn't our first. The truth is all of our hardware, almost all of our hardware is European that we've been buying for 40 years. And so we do have experience in doing this. The glass, the first glass we bought internationally was from Tivitec. But that's a good bit different than hardware, which the kits are already made and you're ordering a kit.
Well, what's so interesting to me, if you really think about it, is hardware is acceptable from overseas, and we've been doing it for decades, and nobody bats an eye at it. Glass has become rather acceptable from overseas. I think the World Trade Center was sourced out of China.
One Vanderbilt.
There you
Tivitec.
go, out of Spain. Yet extrusions can be sourced overseas. People usually don't ask questions. As soon as you talk about the entire assembly, all of a sudden, these red flags go off and a lot of questions are asked.
Yeah, I think it's about quality control. What are people doing overseas versus here? And do you have the appropriate skilled labor? Can you meet the requirements that we have here? And I think forever there was this sort of notion of like, no, it's impossible. You can't meet the requirements. But I look around and people are doing it every day now, and it's a threat to us. It's a challenge. It's something that it means that we have to crank up our competitiveness and our capabilities and our product features to combat that, because look, what are we competing against? Labor costs at the end of the day. I don't know that, yeah, maybe there are some outfits from a capability standpoint that are super advanced, but I'd be happy to pit us against any, advanced fabricator from any part of the world. But at the end of the day, from me, it comes down to economics. We're in a different economic environment than a lot of other parts of Eastern Europe or South America or China. It's just a different setup.
So as a purebred glazing contractor, you have flexibility to bring in product from wherever you want, as long as you can sell it. But the reality is we're first and foremost a manufacturer. And so we do have constraints, and we do have the reality of first and foremost having to fill up a plant to keep people on payroll and provide people with jobs. So on that note, what's more challenging in your eyes, the manufacturing side or the installation side of the business?
They're like two different businesses. It's hard to answer that. It's I think from a scheduling standpoint, both are challenging, but in fairness to manufacturing, with all of the components that has to come together in order to make a window, when you deal with new construction projects where the schedule is always moving, it's just the nature of the beast. And we are then feeding installation with finished product. It makes the job of manufacturing very challenging to do in the most efficient way possible, right? You think about any of these buildings and what does a perfect manufacturing system want to look like? All right, I only want 5 types, and I want to build all of the A types, and then I want to build all of the B types, and then the C's, the D's, and the E's. Well, first of all, we never get 5 types. I think we had a job in Brooklyn. I'm forgetting the name. I know I see the building in my head, but it was 1,000 windows and 900 types. And it's like, you drive yourself a good bit insane. And even if you had 5 types, we're going to install by floor. So we're going to build 5 A's, 5 B's, 5 C's, and then do that all over again because we're feeding our install. So we are by no means set up based upon how we do things to be the perfectly efficient manufacturer. You couple on top of that changes to the schedule. For example, hey, we have a problem with the concrete on the 2nd floor, but the 3rd floor is ready. Well, the 3rd floor windows are different from the 2nd floor. We have 5 that are in overlap, but the rest are not. All right, I'm going to go borrow the 5, bring them to the 3rd, and then figure out how to reorganize the material from the 2nd floor to build for the 3rd floor. And then I got to figure out how do I then get the right material to build for the 2nd floor that's going to be ready at a later time than what I was originally planning for. This is what our team deals with every day, and I have come to really appreciate the difficulty in what they do to make our operation work. I mean, it's significant. And I think that a lot of times with contractors, I mean, we're one of many subcontractors that are being, dealt with in this way, right? But I do think the facade component of a building is one of the most complex, whereas HVAC or concrete or, the interior program, there just aren't as many components. And we're always up against the clock to enclose the building. It's, not to say that others aren't up against the clock as well, but, many of the other trades, plumbing, electrical, are dealing with more standardized components where so much of what we do is customized to the project, and it's a race. And it's a race based upon what's ready.
I was going to ask you what you wish people knew about our industry, but I think that's a good answer. I think they don't actually see the complexities and the nuances and the start-stop nature of the construction industry with schedules, and ultimately everybody wanting to accomplish the same thing. But with that, I mean, I don't know how many other companies really face this, but I feel like half of our job is just managing. This says go, move here. This says stop, move there, and just the complexity and nuance of all of it.
That to me is a large part of the art of what we do, and managing that correctly. And I don't want to say that we always get it right. We definitely get it wrong sometimes, but we're trying always to get it right. And I think, listen, I don't envy the general contractors who are managing 50 of us, and trying to orchestrate the whole show going on. But um, we're doing everything that we can to deliver the best project possible in an impactful way for the owner, for the client, for the architect, but also in a profitable way for us as well. And that's a constant battle of, you know, the game of hurry up and stop, um, or fast forward, build extra, work overtime to then not have work, because you tried to build quicker to try to help somebody out. Helps out the client, hurts us. And so that's a battle that I think any manufacturer is facing on a regular basis.
So you mentioned earlier Shuko and tying that into this conversation. What I think is an interesting comparison is a little bit to our detriment. I think the way that Shuko's model and perspective about the German market and requirements and sort of pushing that onto the American market, I think historically Skyline had a little bit of that mentality with the New York mentality and model and pushing that onto other markets. So what have you learned in the past few years about New York versus other markets, and how have you sort of shifted your perspective?
Yeah, so this will probably be, an interesting debate amongst people who are a little bit more seasoned than us. But if you ask my father, and probably if my grandfather were around, who built the first tilt and turn window in the United States, but I think they would both say is we did. And I remember going to the bow. I think I was 18. I didn't know anything really. And sitting in meetings with my father, even potentially my grandfather back then, looking at hardware that no one else, there was no American customers. We were the only American customer. Um, and so, why am I saying that? It's not important whether we were the first or not. But I think part of our mentality has been to adopt the European style of window manufacturing early on. Why? Because, in my opinion, and I think a lot would agree with this, they have just always been that much more advanced than we have from just a purely American, standpoint of Windows, how we think of Windows, and the technology behind Windows. Even to this day, there are facade schools you can attend in Europe. I've yet to hear of a single facade school in America anywhere. Um, there's much more of a focus in Europe on um, the technology behind facades, and part of it, I think, has to deal with how Europeans think about building buildings and also the residential market. I think in Europe and many other parts of the world, it's very common for people to live in one home for almost their whole life. And so when they invest in that home, it's a serious investment, of, hey, I'm putting in new windows. Well, I want these windows to be here for 30, 40, 50 years, perform at a very high level, and give me the energy performance, the acoustic performance that I need. So, we're talking about Shuko. Um, I've known about Shuko for a long time. And I think my first introduction was at the bow. And I'll just say being blown away by uh, it's not fair to call it a booth. It's a performance. Uh, it's beyond amazing what they do at these shows to display their products. But what has always impressed me about them is the sense of pushing the envelope for things that maybe nobody was asking for initially, that then all of a sudden become what everybody wants. U values that you think are just not obtainable, and they figure out how to get there. Um, Hardware and components that, you first see as well, that'd be nice to have, one day, and then become a standard as far as what people want. Um, Little things like taking the base plates of hardware and making them disappear, just so that the look is that much better, and doing it before anybody else does it. So, as we formed this, partnership with them, getting much more intimate with them and understanding how they think about it and what their approach is, really, I think made for a very interesting marriage between the two companies, because I feel that Skyline has always been trying to push the envelope on those areas too. And that was why I mentioned, being one of the first to bring a tilt and turn window here, because that means we were one of the first people to offer it. You know, our tilt and turn, is a unique product that we offer that most people have never seen before. But we have done so much business with that product because of its uniqueness and what it can offer people from a comfort standpoint, from an ease of use, from an ADA. I mean, there's so many boxes that we can check. And so I think the opportunity that's in front of us with Ashuko is really tremendous, as far as putting the two sort of know-hows together, looking at their capabilities, taking some of that and bringing it into the American market in the right way, and saying, "Wow, look at what we can do together." Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to say there, but that's sort of skimming the surface.
What you just said about facade school, we have somebody internally that actually went to facade school in Germany, and it's quite amazing. And I think about a big issue that we have in this industry is a lot of tribal knowledge in the older generation and attracting young talent and new people into the industry. And I wonder if their focus on performance and focus on facades and focus on culture and education is what keeps more and more talent coming into the industry. And I guess where you think that's missing in our market.
I think there are some. I have a couple thoughts on that. Yes, I agree. They are out in front, educating people, educating themselves, educating their team in a regular fashion. I think I had heard they have, 65, 70% market share in Germany. Like, that's not a mistake. That's not an accident. That's a well executed plan of educating people as to why their product is the best. And that may also mean that people are paying more for it in certain areas. Um, I think with how I mean, one thing that has always impressed me, and I think this answers your question as well, their digital side of their business, as far as not just promotional materials, but educational materials. I've joked, like, with a couple $1 million, like, if you had a couple $1 million, you could get Shuko equipment, Shuko profiles, and access to how to build a window, probably without having to really interface with a human being. They would say, no, that's not true. You need to, have some training. But my point is they have such amazing documentation on how to put things together that they're making it easier for people. Whereas some of the challenges that we face is slowing down and saying, all right, how do we explain this new design that we just came up with, from A to Z? And I think, some of the cultural differences are, we often feel we don't have time to do that because we're on to the next thing. And I think that's going to be where some of the interesting learning comes between these two companies, is saying, like, all right, well, how do you guys do it? You create new stuff all the time. We create new stuff all the time, and you've got all this documentation and, know-hows and trainings, and, we have some of that, but not all of it, So how do we learn from that? And how do we start to use some of what they've been able to do as something that we can start to do, to our benefit, not just from the selling more work, but to advancing the knowledge of people, so that what they can do expands. It's the tribal knowledge is a real thing here, right? You've got people who are around for 30, 40 years and have just, like, been there. They just have seen it, and they've been in the weeds. And I've always felt like you learn the most when something goes wrong, and it's just because you end up getting in the thick of it. And it's almost like the approach of, like, there's something wrong with my car. In order to really understand it, I'm just going to take my car apart, to figure out what went wrong. You probably learn a lot. I don't know if you ever put it back together again, but that's how a lot of people here have learned. They just got into it, and realize, oh, okay, well, if we do that, that's going to be a problem, or, oh, I remember when that happened. I think the difference of Ashuko is they've been documenting and teaching that all along the way.
I will say, from a capability or pushing the envelope standpoint, in the construction industry in general here is very slow to adapt and change. But when I see just what they're doing, I don't know how widespread the implementation is, but in terms of imagining what's possible, I think they're really I'm thinking from an inspirational standpoint, from young designers and changing the way we build and changing the way we think. I talk about this on this podcast all the time, but adopting a little bit more of that European mindset. And Spencer talks a lot about how in that market, the facade is first and foremost the first conversation. It's not an afterthought. And I think we're trending in that direction, but I think we were lagging for so long.
I think we're trending more in that direction as well. But again, as I mentioned, the viewpoint of construction, even on a commercial side versus a residential side, I think is fundamentally different there than here. And so I think a lot of these rules and regulations are almost forcing us into more of that kind of thinking. But there's also, you look at the sustainability work that Schuko does, that's not for bottom line dollars. That's for the benefit of the world, and I think that we are trying to adapt some of that, but it's being done through more of the stick approach than it is sort of the, goodness of your heart approach. Because I think part of what we are facing here, and I know that they're facing it in Europe as well, is the economics aren't yet tying out. Putting in the photovoltaic glass, that costs $85 a square foot and creates energy for your building doesn't tie out on the spreadsheet over 10 years for having any sort of a payback. So why are we going to do it? Well, yeah, it's a cleaner energy, but again, we all have, families to feed and businesses to run. It's becoming a greater part of our thinking, the carbon impact, the sustainability, all those different things. But I think it needs to keep advancing, and they're certainly leading the pack.
So does this whole thing make you excited? I'll call it excite you for the future. And do you think it creates a new path to try to, attract and inspire younger talent?
There's no question. I mean, there's no question. I mean, we're going to learn from them. They're going to learn from us. But I mean, one of the things I've always loved is, especially from a kid, I mean, I remember, I think I was 6 years old and my dad was getting a new car and I think it was a Chrysler. And I remember being in the dealership, and my dad, saying, well, I need a sunroof. And I remember saying like, Dad, why do you need a sunroof? He's like, I need to look every day at what I do, for a living. And like, that's always stuck with me like forever, as far as like, it's cool to go around. And I know you do this and I do it, you're walking around the city or different cities where you've done work and you're kind of like, you're there and here. And, you end up kind of doing this thing where you're just like staring up all the time. And I think if you combine that, the fact that we're doing a tangible thing with the notion of technology, sustainability, what we can offer in building not just more comfort for people, but interesting solutions, whether that's for the general contractor, the end user who's using the product. For me, that's exciting, where you're part of, building someone's home, building someone's office, changing someone's home or office for the better. Like that, like that's a real thing that we do on an everyday basis that for me, I think it's pretty cool. Maybe it's not for everybody, but I've always felt that was really cool. And yes, I have a sunroof, and yes, I do look up and look at all the buildings that we do.
And I'm sure you pointed out to your son, even though he's not paying attention, you'll get
Yeah,
there.
I think as a little guy, he's getting there, but understanding these are daddy's windows, we'll get there soon enough.
Yep. All right, this was fun. I think it would be good to have someone from Schuko on to maybe counter some of those stances and maybe say some of the flaws we have in our thinking and perspective, but it would be a really good dialogue. So I'd love to have you back.
That could be part two.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on, Matt. A lot of fun.